I wouldn't have chosen those things. I wouldn't have chosen to be beaten by my father. I wouldn't have chosen to have my sister die at 17. She was my only sibling. There are all kinds of things that I wouldn't have chosen. There are realities that I live with right now that I wouldn't have chosen. But I still trust that in and beyond them, God's providence is at work and that God is there.
You're listening to the Embrace What Matters podcast, bridging the things of eternity with everyday experience. Here's your host, John Michalak.
Welcome to the special edition of Embrace What Matters. In the last episode, I interviewed Arthur Boers, which included two parts. Part 1 was focused on topics relating to one of Arthur's earlier books, Living into Focus. Part 2 focused on Arthur's newest book, Shattered, coming out this May. This special episode includes only Part 2 as a courtesy for those mostly interested in hearing about Arthur's newest book. I hope it's a blessing. Arthur Boers has written on the subject of the intersection of Christian faith and daily life for the past 30 years. Holding several advanced degrees, he has engaged the world as seminary professor, Benedictine oblate, church priest, and pastor. He currently serves as an ordained Anglican priest in Ontario, Canada. In addition to Arthur's extensive contributions to numerous Christian journals and publications, he has written 7 books, including Living into Focus, Choosing What Matters in an Age of Distractions. He's also written The Way is Made by Walking, a book documenting his pilgrimage along the Camino de Santiago. He's also written books on discipleship, prayer, church leadership, and conflict resolution. Arthur's latest book is a beautiful and powerful memoir on his early and often traumatic life as the son of Reformed Dutch immigrants. In the following conversation, we discuss Arthur's new memoir, including the purpose and impact of creative but truthful storytelling. We discuss Arthur's early calling to a life of faith and ministry, and the details of his complicated relationship with an abusive father. Finally, we discuss his process of understanding and healing that has followed. Join me now for this enriching and fascinating conversation. So that transitions us into talking about your book that you have coming out next year. I believe it's May of 2023. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So the title, and you can find this on Amazon. I'll include a link in the description. The title is Shattered. A son picks up the pieces of his father's rage.
Correct.
And you were kind enough to send me a copy to read before it was finished, for which I'm grateful. So we'll get more into the depth of the book in a bit, but give us a summary of what the book's about and why you decided to write it.
So I'm in my mid-60s now, and I've done a lot of things in my life. I've pastored a number of churches, and I was a professor at a couple different seminaries. I went to school a lot. I have a ridiculous amount of education. And I'm telling you this not to brag, but to say that in many ways, my life has been successful. I've accomplished a lot if you measure life in terms of accomplishment.
Yeah.
And about half a dozen years ago, I started to realize that, yes, I have accomplished things in life, and I think I've accomplished things that I thought I set out to accomplish, and I can feel good about that. Nevertheless, I come here into my later years, and I realize that there are aspects of my life that still aren't working. I still struggle with depression, for example. And I still struggle with emotions that at times seem unmanageable. And so I've been trying to understand that. And I'm trying to understand, how can you make your life work all your life long, but it still feels like some important things are not working? And so there's a mystery there.
Yeah.
And the more I thought about it, the more I came back to thinking about my childhood. The other thing that was going on at the same time was that I have been a writer all my life, and that's been important to me. I've written as a pastor, as I mentioned before. That's been important to me. But about 15 years ago, I started to realize that there were different kinds and qualities of writing. And I came to admire folks that sometimes we call their writing creative nonfiction, literary nonfiction.
Right.
People who not only write about great ideas and insights that I want to know about, but they take writing, even factual writing, nonfiction writing, to a new level of qualities of beauty. And I thought, I want to learn how to write better. I want to learn how to write literary nonfiction. That's something that I aspire to. And you can actually, if you studied my books, you would see that I had a book published in 2003, which I like just fine, but it's a very practical, functional book. But when I wrote my book about the Camino in Spain, that was where I had started to write differently. And there's a kind of a different quality of writing, I would argue, in the Camino book than in my previous books. And I've tried to maintain that with my writing. But with these latest two things, starting to think about what are some of the roots of the issues that I'm dealing with, and how can I write in a more lovely and captivating way, I decided to write about my childhood, my growing up. And I did grow up here in Canada. I was born here in Canada, but I was the oldest child of Dutch immigrants. So we always spoke Dutch at home. I didn't learn English until I started playing with neighbors in the street when I was 4 years old. And even when I went to kindergarten, I had a very strong accent, so that the English name that my parents gave me and couldn't pronounce, I also was not able to pronounce. I remember the kindergarten teacher had to teach me how to pronounce my name because the Dutch doesn't have the TH sound.
Yeah.
All of this to say that growing up, I was kind of what missionary kids call themselves third culture kids. I was a third culture kid. And what that means is I didn't really know what culture I belonged to. I felt very Dutch. I went to a Dutch church. Most of our acquaintances spoke Dutch. Our family spoke Dutch. My dad's customers and employees all spoke Dutch. So I sort of thought, I'm not Canadian, I'm Dutch. Eventually, I went to Holland and I realized I'm not Dutch either. I could speak Dutch, but I'm not Dutch. That's a different culture. And then I thought, well, I'm neither. So that was one huge dynamic in my childhood. Another dynamic in my childhood was that I've always had a deep faith and an experience of God. Even when I was 4 years old, I experienced a call to ministry, even though that kind of language or terminology or idea was very foreign, certainly to my family, but even in the church that I attended. So I had a very lively kind of relationship with God. It was a childlike relationship and in many ways childish, but it was real and it undergirded me, and it still undergirds me. I still draw on it. So those were two really important influences on me. But the third influence was my father was a violent man. And my first and oldest memory, the first thing that I can remember at all, was seeing my father throw a houseplant at my mother. She ducked. It went through the picture window of our the picture window in our living room. And so my very first memory in life is an act of violence of my father, who wrestled with anger. He wrestled with temper, with rage, and on a couple of notable occasions, I was on the receiving end. And when I was 7 years old, he beat me into a blackout. I remember everything that led up to that beating in great detail. I can remember everything. I can remember him approaching me. I can remember seeing the look of rage on his face, and then I completely black out for several hours. I remember waking up several hours later. And I'm a person that has very vivid memories, so that's quite striking that that would blank out. So in the book, I start to wrestle with the problem of, or the mystery of my father's anger. And clearly my father had PTSD, a term that's, it's kind of out, we hear it a lot now, I know we do. But my dad lived through the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, which was a terrifying time. And then he volunteered to be a soldier in a colonial war in Indonesia, which is a very brutal war and affected him. And he had a father who beat him. And my great-grandfather also beat my grandfather. So there's this kind of a history of violence in my family, which my father dialed down to a degree. He didn't beat me as often as his father beat him, for example. So I've been trying to wrestle with the mystery of my father's anger, and of course that has an effect on me. And I have, in fact, concluded that I too have PTSD, and that affects a number of my emotional struggles. And it's a reason for my depression, and it's a reason, in some ways, it's a reason why. It's one of the contributing reasons why I became a pastor. It also makes pastoring more complicated. I think it helps me be a pastor because it helped create a deep empathy for the pain of other people. I would say that I feel emotional pain every day. And I think that helps me listen to and care for others who are in pain. The place where it gets complicated is that it also means that I'm extra sensitive to other people's emotions and opinions. I'm kind of hyper alert all the time. And as a pastor, there are all these relationships that you're always negotiating and paying attention to. And so that was very very tiring whenever I was the leader of a congregation. So in my book, which I tried to write about in a beautiful way, I weave these themes together. And the book is called Shattered, not just because my father broke a window, and not just because he broke and battered me in some way, shattered me, but also because glass was huge in our life. My father's business was building greenhouses and selling materials for greenhouses. And so there was just glass everywhere, and there were glass accidents often. And so glass really looms large in my life. And so as a literary device, I try to bring glass and broken glass in throughout the book. In fact, one of my first job for my dad was going to construction sites when I was 11 and picking up broken glass, because when you glazed greenhouses, put glass on the greenhouses, there were always panes that broke, or the glass had to be cut, and the part that was cut off would drop on the ground and shatter. So my first job was cleaning up broken glass. As I was doing this book, I remembered the fact that I have a grandfather who actually, and this is a long story, it is in the book, but my grandfather ate peaches that were needled with broken glass. He didn't realize it at the time. He wouldn't have done it otherwise, but he was hungry. And so he ate all these dangerous peaches, and he had abdominal damage for years and years. And so I've thought about the role of glass and broken glass in my family, but I also talk about how broken glass can be overcome. It can be transcended. So, for example, I really like beach glass, and beach glass comes from broken glass that goes through the trauma of waves and currents and sand, but comes out with the color changed and very, very beautiful. Or I tell a story of an important encounter that I had with Henry Nouwen a number of years ago where I broke something that belonged to him that was made of glass. And Henry Nouwen, with his Dutch accent, pronouncing my name the way my father did, who was a priest and therefore a father, was obviously a father figure in my life. And when I accidentally broke this valuable candle holder, I was quite afraid of his response, but his response was very healing and redemptive. And so the device of glass and broken glass, shattered glass, is a way that I hope to explore the real dangers that I encountered and the sorrows that ensued, but also to look at how God worked healing in my life.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So let me revisit a few of the things that you've just talked about.
Okay.
And so let's step back a little bit. First of all, just a process question. You talked about learning literary nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're a pastor, and you talked about Living into Focus kind of being a pastoral book.
Correct.
And you talked about the idea of literary nonfiction being a way to impart beauty in story and evoke different things in people. I don't know how I lie, but I'm maybe 60-40 left brain, right brain. So part of my left brain wants to think about objective, So what is the the objective of narrative nonfiction, literary nonfiction? Some stories are just there to entertain, to bring us joy or sorrow. Other stories, like yours, seem to point us to something deeper. So are these stories about simply teaching us something? Are they meant to encourage us, connect us to each other? What do you think? There's a didactic purpose, or do you think it goes way beyond that when it comes to literary nonfiction or memoir?
So he's saying, what is the function of literary nonfiction? Is that your question?
I guess I'm asking you, do you have when writing it, was it simply about sharing your story, or did you have a pastoral objective to it? And if you did, how did you want to reach people through this genre? How do you want to affect them or reach them?
Okay, so I guess I'll try to answer in a couple different ways. First of all, I would say that I think that one of the, I don't know if I'd want to call it a function, but one of the deep purposes of literary nonfiction is to communicate through beauty. That is to say that we're not only persuaded. What did you say? You're mostly left brain. Do you think you're
probably lean more left than right? Yeah.
Yeah, and I am too. So, reasoning persuades me, logic persuades me.
Yeah.
Although we're all more complicated than we think. We're convinced on other levels too. But but if you asked me on the surface, that's what I would respond. But there's also something about beauty that persuades, and so literary nonfiction works through beauty. I think through aesthetics.
Mm-hmm.
I think was it Dostoevsky? This was a quote that Dorothy Day loved a lot. Dostoevsky said something like, "Beauty will save the world."
Mm-hmm.
And I like to think about that. And I like to think, well, he was a Christian. I like to think as a Christian and as a theological type, is that true? And in some ways I would say it is true. And sometimes some ways I wouldn't say it's true.
Yeah.
Although one of the reasons I'm a Christian, this is something I think a lot about. I have so many friends who are no longer Christians. It really baffles me. And so I've been examining myself. Why am I a Christian? And one of the reasons I'm a Christian is because Christian faith is beautiful. The Christian story is beautiful. So I think beauty is important. And God, the creator, loves beauty. So that's the kind of general comment about literary nonfiction. I wanted to write a story from my childhood that explored the themes that I mentioned to you, including the difficult themes, but I wanted to write them in a kind of captivating way that would draw in other people.
Yeah.
Not everybody reads my teaching books, so I wrote a book on the use of technology. I've written a book about morning and evening prayer, a book about theology of leadership and dealing with conflict, on and on and on. And I like those books. I like all those books.
Right.
But there's a certain kind of didactic sense to them that doesn't speak to everyone. And so I wanted to tell a story, a true story, that might draw in people who wouldn't necessarily read my other stuff. But I also want to give permission to my readers to examine their own lives, to see if there are sorrows or suffering in their life, to realize that they're not alone. I do this as a pastor, in my preaching. I name things in my own life. I have to be careful about how I do this, but I name things in my life about things that have been hard. And one of the reasons I do that is that I don't want them to think that the Christian life is just about triumph and victory, and we should push down and hide the places that are hard. I want them to know that they're not alone. Yeah. And writing is one of the reasons we write, you and I. I'm thinking you, but I know for me for sure. One of the reasons I write is I want to be heard. I want other people to know what's important to me and to recognize the priorities that I value. And but I also want other people to feel heard, to know that they are not alone in the things that they face. The things that they face probably aren't exactly what I face, but there's enough parallel or enough resonance that it will give them permission to explore them and name them honestly.
That's great. So was it a concern for you? Because you talk about you having this, from my perspective, and probably a lot of, if people are picking up this new book that have read your other books, I saw you as a wise thinker, pastor, theologian. I was looking at all your accomplishments and specifically what the gifts that you had to offer to me, in a person that seeks meaning. And so I was, reading this book, I was a little startled. I said, wait, there's more going on here.
Really?
And that probably says more about me than it does you. So however naive, I think we assume that the wise people that we turn to don't share our troubles because they're wise. They have lives that are above and beyond. So was that ever a concern for you in writing the book? Was it, or maybe it was an objective? I mean, in other words, revealing a fuller context or picture of who you've been and who you've become. Was that an objective, or was that a concern in kind of saying this is sort of a bigger picture of who I am?
Objective or concern? I've always been a pretty forthcoming person. Actually, I'm pretty honest and forthright, and tell people where I am. And in some contexts, that meant that I probably couldn't be a pastor because I am honest about some of the struggles in the Christian life.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I suppose it was an objective. It was not a concern. I mean, it's true that I'm honest about struggles that I have. That's true.
Right.
But it's also clear, and this too is true, that I'm still a Christian. And my Christian faith is deeper than it was in the past. And the struggles that I have faced, I think, make me a better Christian and a better pastor. So, I'm not shy or embarrassed about that. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not.
You are, man. I may have been kind of putting myself in your shoes, saying, at least literally, probably in your ministry as a pastor, you talk about being very forthright. But maybe the Camino book was you were pretty transparent in that. But a lot of your books have been kind of teaching books and encouragement books that don't necessarily reveal the underbelly so much. So that's maybe where I was coming from. But you also talk about seeing the greater context, that the Bible isn't just about how-tos. It's not just about victory and joy. And the Bible has a great deal to do with suffering, with weakness, with sin, with waiting for resolution, all these things. And so, and kind of in, maybe it's a Western cultural thing, just the evangelical world, especially, we're so caught up in the how-to and the victory stuff. And again, not against that stuff, but there's got to be a balance, and I think your book achieves that balance a little bit. So let me ask one more kind of literary technical question about metaphor. So you mentioned how the title of the book involves glass. So much of the book involves you telling stories about your engagement with glass that shatters, just all sorts of descriptions, literary descriptions about glass. And let me just read one passage that you wrote. You said, "Were I permitted, I'd go in search of beach glass. I've always enjoyed such weathered refuse, turning it in my palm, holding it to the light. Glass that ends up in water rolls and tumbles and waves and currents over rocks and through sand, gradually breaking down and being shaped into smaller and smaller pieces. Saber sharp edges wear away, smooth surfaces scoured. The glass takes on a frosty look, etched by sandy grit. It shapes haphazardly, though often into triangles or tears. Such trauma-induced transformations can take up to 10 years, or may go on for 50. Trash gradually changes from hazardous to harmless, even beautiful." And I wanted to share that because that hopefully the listeners can see some of the beauty of your writing and what we've been talking about. That these descriptions of real things like the material of glass, but the beauty evokes something in us that goes beyond just the logic, excuse me, the left brain, in such a way, maybe in the way that we're supposed to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. I think too many of us focus on the mind and strength when it comes to our spirituality, and so these descriptions evoke a little bit more than that. But so, is glass just a coincidental metaphor for you in the book, or is it meant to? Do you want your readers to draw these types of meanings? Because certainly you point to certain types of meanings. That a trashy piece of glass could move from hazardous to harmless to beautiful. What was your use of metaphor in the book? Was it simply just descriptive, evocative, or were you trying to point towards certain meanings that you want people to draw?
Early on in this process, when I was writing about these kinds of things, I did an MFA in creative nonfiction, and I wrote an essay that was called, I don't know what I was called, but it was I just realized that glass played this huge role throughout my life. So there's all kinds of stories that I didn't tell. Yeah. But there were a number of incidents in my life, including I was a very well-behaved teenager, but when I got an air rifle, a friend and we shot out all the windows of a shed near his family's house. That's like one of the worst things I've ever done in my life. And my parents never found out, and they still don't. My dad's not around. My mom's still living, but they never knew what I did. So there was just all this glass. And David James Duncan, I think that's his name, David James Duncan, his book is like My Life Through Water or something. So partly I was just thinking about that idea, and then I was thinking about how my life could be told through glass. And it really is, as I thought about it, it's really remarkable that my first memory is my father breaking glass.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable that his work was bound up with glass. And as a result, my summer jobs were for a number of years. That my grandfather ate ground glass, not on purpose, but it affected him for 20 years. Glass is just everywhere present in my life. And so it's not a device. I mean, it's there. And I'm a bit of a mystic, as you know. And so I think there's meaning there. And so I latched onto it, and I worked with it. I didn't tell all the glass stories, but I highlighted the ones that helped form a narrative arc. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not.
You are.
Glass is it's a mysterious substance. Some say it's not a liquid and not solid. We need glass through our lives. We talked about technology earlier. You and I just think about the role of glass in technology in so many different ways. So it was there. That I just kept working with it. And then the other kind of lesser motif is the importance of water in my life, being beside water. And I mentioned earlier how I love to paddle. But there have been all these instances. I had an experience with broken glass at the beach when I was 11, where I ended up going to the hospital emergency room because broken glass at the beach led me to need stitches. So glass and water are both there, and the water often ends up being the context for healing. So the last chapter in my book is I sit in a room of glass. Some of it's broken for some reason, and it overlooks the water where I love to paddle. And paddling is one of the key places where I encounter God and where I experience healing. One of my friends who's a writing teacher says that sometimes we're just given these amazing, how did she put it? Some things are thrown in our lap. I wrote an essay once. So one day I was invited to go to a private club, a fishing club, trout. They raised their own trout. It was very elite, behind a fence, and you couldn't see into it. And I and some friends had a special invitation to go there for a meal, which we did. And the very next day, I went to visit a friend who was serving life in a prison, and there was also a meal involved. And the contrast and the parallels of these two isolated places that you could only get into by special invitation, and one was very high class and one was very oppressed, was kind of stunning. And when I wrote that essay, my writing teacher said, boy, sometimes things just drop into your lap, and but you have to be paying attention. Right. And that I do, that I do for my life. I pay attention, and I think you can see that in the book, that I see these themes and these threads throughout my life. That it's probably because I'm an INFJ like you. That's probably part of it. Not everybody looks at life that way, but I do, and it's also interesting to think about. You can see already in my childhood how important pastors were to me. Pastors are in that plate all over, and sometimes they mess up a little. And now I'm an older pastor, and I realize how, and I disdained them back then. Now I'm an older guy who's been a pastor for a number of years, and I understand how pastors mess up. By mess up, I don't mean violate rules or boundaries, but, make judgment calls that maybe are questionable or aren't always pastoral or whatever. Yeah. So you could see how important the pastors were to me. So that's interesting to me. You can also see in my childhood how I was being formed to be a pastor in some very striking ways. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I noticed when I wrote the book and read it and revised it was, you can see how I was moving toward eventually becoming a sacramental liturgical Christian. Mm-hmm. I didn't grow up in that kind of tradition. And in high school, I left the tradition I grew up in, and I joined a Mennonite church. Yeah, excuse me, an evangelical Mennonite church that I would say is more sectarian, and that was a good experience for me at that point. But later in life, as you know, I've become an Anglican, and I'm an Anglican priest now. And I know you like the word contentment. I feel a lot of contentment. But I would never have predicted as a child, we didn't have a very high regard for liturgical Christians, whether Catholics or Anglicans or Orthodox. I would not have predicted that would become meaningful to me. And And yet now, as I look back, I see how I was drawn, for example, to certain Catholics and the way that they expressed their faith. And I was drawn to a nativity scene that a Dutch Catholic family had near me. Protestants didn't have nativity scenes then. Or I went to, we went with friends to their Catholic church, which was pretty radical for my parents because normally our kind of people never visited a Catholic church,
right?
Because they were idolaters. And I went to a Catholic church and I was fascinated by the statues. You know, they really drew me as a child. And I look at that and I go, oh, some of this goes way back.
As it often goes with these interviews, God's kind of directing things because I said this book is in many ways about formation. And so one of the dynamics is the tradition that you came out of, you know, the Dutch Reformed Calvinist. You know, for those who may not be aware, you know, Calvinism, Reformed faith has a lot to do with the fact that we're predestined, that we are the elect. I always find it funny that the elect always think they're the elect, but when it comes to formation, just the dynamics in the book are so interesting to me. And so one of them, and I relate to a lot of them, the father and son dynamic for sure. And I sympathize and related to a lot of, you know, what you have, and we all have different levels of trauma in our life, things we want to remember and don't want to remember. But one of the fact that you and your father were similar, like every relationship, you were similar in certain ways, but you were also very different, and those differences kind of merged in you as you were entering into your teen years.
Right.
But just let me kind of lay some of that out. So you are a pastor and an intellectual when he was maybe more simple and valued the hands-on blue collar lifestyle. Your politics eventually differed. You had different views on war versus pacifism. Your theology differed. Your views on social justice and how to treat other people. So we're this weird mystery of the dynamic or progress of your formation, the tensions between sovereignty, God, what God is doing above all of us, to the plan that He has for our lives and our free will, that kind of thing. How have you understood those differences? Because in one sense, you could say, and I identify with this, that there are things that I didn't like about my dad growing up, and my formation has kind of gone to the other extreme, you know? And so was that why that happened? You know, was God above that, kind of forming me all along? Do you think some of your formation was really a reaction to some of the abuse and the neglect that you suffered? How have you processed your formation when it comes to how different you were from your dad or your childhood experience?
Okay, I didn't think that's where your question was going. I want to answer another one first, and
Sure.
I'm willing to come back to that if you want.
That's fine.
I was very serious about my faith growing up. I was serious about going to church. I had a lot of questions. Big one in high school was predestination. I argued with the minister about that a lot. And then I finally decided that our church was not evangelical enough, and I joined an evangelical Mennonite church, which was not done very often. It's very common now for people to move around, but it was not done as much back then, especially in our church, because our church was ethnically tight and close. She didn't leave. And when I left, I was quite disdainful of the church that I was leaving behind. And so I had that kind of attitude for a number of years. And but over time, I've grown more ecumenical and more appreciative of different traditions. I became a pastor, and then I realized how complicated it is to become a pastor. I grew more compassionate for those pastors. I became friends with Eugene Peterson, whom I've mentioned. And, he makes a case for predestination that I find quite winsome, actually. I can't repeat it right now, but when I read it, I thought, oh, yeah, well, that kind of makes sense. I could buy that.
Yeah.
And and also I've become frustrated, in all honesty, I've become frustrated with how easily we move from church to church. I think that there's some real hazards there. Something else that Eugene certainly emphasize. So then I felt bad about having left the church of my childhood. I read Wendell Berry, who argues about for stability and faithfulness and loyalty to a community, and I'm like, I didn't do that, and so I felt really ambivalent or embarrassed, especially because not only did I leave to become Mennonite, now a little over a decade ago I became Anglican. It's like, oh, I'm on this weird trajectory. I keep leaving and changing. Yeah. What do I do with that? And writing the book did a couple things, and one was I actually have way more appreciation for the way that I was brought up. I don't agree with all of it, but the Christian Reform taught me how to take theology seriously. They're really interested in the kind of intellectual side of Christian faith, which I think is important. It's not the most important, and it's not the only important, but it's important. And when I was a Mennonite pastor, I had a friend who used to tell me, another Mennonite minister, he said, Arthur, you're Mennonite in your theology, but you do theology like a Calvinist. And what he meant was that I take it very seriously, which is true. And I do it deliberately and with discipline. And those things are true. And, and I grew up with the Bible. I grew up with the importance of the Bible. I grew up with the vision of the biblical story. We went to church every week. We prayed after our meals. We read the Bible every day after supper. So in retrospect, I'm very grateful for all kinds of aspects about my upbringing. The thing that I see, though, is I also see that I was not that suited to the context, or there were aspects where I was not that suited. And what I mean by that is I was not satisfied with a faith that was primarily intellectual. I think the intellectual analysis is important, but it's not enough for me. I am also emotional in my faith, and I am mystical in my faith. And the emotional aspects and the mystical aspects are downplayed in Calvinism, at least the Calvinism that I grew up in. And so I was not that good a fit. And in fact, I have some very good friends who are Calvinist ministers, and one of them is an atheist, and one of them is, he would call himself a post-theist. And I have a lot of conversations with them, and in our conversations, we realized that their faith had always been intellectual. And when the intellectual stuff didn't work for them anymore, it was hard for them to remain Christians. And for me, I've always had those other elements as really, really important, really thriving. So I think that's what I want to say, is that the book helped me think through some of my thoughts about having changed traditions, and to acknowledge, I was a self-righteous punk when I left the Christian Reform. There's no doubt about it. But there was also the hand of God working through the mixedness of Arthur Boers.
Yeah. You mentioned in the book how occasionally people who have been aware of your trauma have asked you whether you've forgiven your father, and you say how that almost feels like a demand or a rote thing, like you should just forgive him because the Bible tells you to, or that kind of thing. And you talk about there's certainly a nuance to that you felt some level of forgiveness for him. But one of the things you see throughout the book is that your father was a complicated man. He wasn't, this comic book pure evil villain. There's so many good things that he did for you and your family. Yeah. And you also compare him to previous generations that were far more violent, and even other fathers that you knew so he was complicated. And you also mentioned a lot of this nuance of love and pain, where you wanted this connection with a man who couldn't connect. You wanted to love him. You wanted to receive this love. So this is typical of many, familial abusive relationships, where this mix of love and pain exists. And so I wonder, and maybe you can confirm this or not, but like you said, there's a rote intellectual way of approaching even something like healing and forgiveness.
Mhm.
paint by numbers, do this, this, and this, and this, and then you'll feel better about yourself or your past. Clearly, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Mhm.
And so you talk about, you mentioned a lot of times about wanting to understand your father, who he was, what he did, why he did it. But it appears to me that understanding must go way beyond just the intellect. And maybe that's
Mhm.
why this literary nonfiction format, this genre, was
Mm.
really a great way to flesh this out. So maybe why you didn't find, the healing that on the bumper stickers that we might talk about. Talk about the maybe some of the healing that you've had through just the process of writing the book, and maybe where understanding came and how that helped that process.
Yeah. So I the writing the book was really really helpful. I must tell you that I have had one or two people, maybe more than two people, who, including a close family member, who've read the book or parts of the book and weren't aware of all the details, but had known my dad and now say, "I don't like your dad,"
Oh,
or "I have trouble liking your dad."
yeah.
So that actually makes me. I feel sad about that.
Mm,
Um, I always loved my dad.
yeah.
I still love my dad.
Yeah.
I did not love everything he did. I have some pretty big questions about some of the things that he did. I don't know whether he'd ever be able to talk to me about them. I tried to talk about them with him when he died, and that didn't go anywhere. Um, I I can clearly see that my father dialed down the violence. Um, he seriously beat me twice,
Mm,
where he would not be able to count how many times his father beat him. And his father would beat him by kicking him with his construction boots on.
mm,
Um, so that's no comparison. So I see my father dialed down the violence. I see that my father had PTSD, and that causes me to have compassion for him. So the writing of the book, I think, helped me understand things that I didn't understand before. When I started to write about it, I really didn't know anything about PTSD, for example. I also see that I am trapped or wounded by some of the same dynamics that trapped and wounded my father. And I see that more clearly because of the writing, and that also helps me to have compassion for him.
mm,
For me, forgiveness means that it doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean dismissing these things as unimportant. It doesn't mean saying these things were not harmful. There's so many negatives in there. I don't know if that sentence made sense. Um, for me, uh, I forgive my father because I don't want, to me, forgiving my father means I don't want him to suffer for what has happened. I don't want him to be punished
mm,
for what has happened. I don't want God to hold it against him. I expect to see God. I expect to see my Father in heaven by the
mm,
sea of crystal,
mm,
another glass image that
yeah.
was very important to him, a hymn that was important to him and to me. So I do have forgiveness for my father, even while I take very seriously the things that he did to me.
Mm, yeah. So let's wrap up talking about the book. Maybe speak a little bit about the idea of contentment that we started on. Again, we live in this fast food, headline culture that you can have this. If you have this in your life, you'll be happy, and it's so superficial. But even like we said in Christian circles, we have this kind of, this is what it looks like to live a contented life, a happy life. The greater context of Scripture isn't that way. Um, with the Jesus talks about blessedness and happiness for people who mourn, for people that are poor in spirit. The people who lack, they can have a sense of blessedness. Paul talks about rejoicing in our sufferings and how suffering leads to things like hope. And how do you view your life, when it comes to the idea of contentment, whether that's defined as peace, stability, in the context of the trauma that you came from? How do you wrestle with that? How do you define your life when it comes to the idea of content?
So first a smaller answer and then a larger answer. So smaller answer is a spiritual discipline that I find very helpful is called the consciousness examen. And in the consciousness examen, you regularly step aside. A lot of people do this every day, and you review the most recent period of your life, and you look at places where you have met God or been tugged away from God.
Yeah.
And when I do the examen, it brings a lot of clarity to me. I can see that the things that bring me contentment are quality time of listening, talking, even being quiet with my spouse or good friends, going for walks or paddling, being outside, reading, hearing good music. A lot of these things are really, really small. I also see things that tug me away from God. Worries, preoccupation. I have a weakness for playing hearts online and can spend too much time doing that. And so the examen helps me give clarity, because helps give me clarity about the priorities that I want to set in my life, and that leads to contentment. That's the smaller answer.
Yeah.
The larger answer is when I look at my life. I did this on the Camino. When I walked on the Camino, I very carefully reviewed my life, and I came up with a conviction that I could see God throughout my life, and that God had been working God's purposes out throughout my life, and I was grateful for that. And I could tell you honestly that I have had some struggles since then, and so I had some questions about it, and especially struggling around the PTSD stuff and the consequences that that's had for me emotionally.
Yeah,
it's raised questions again that I didn't expect. But writing the book, which was an honest process, I still see that God has been at work throughout my life and in my life, and that there are meaningful themes and threads that go, and that God go through them, and that God had hand in them.
Hmm.
And who was it that it was Meister Eckhart who said, whatever happens to you is the best possible thing for your salvation.
Hmm.
And that's a phrase that I heard at a tough spot in my life, and I decided it was true. And I still believe that it's true. I mean, I wouldn't have chosen those things. I wouldn't have chosen to be beaten by my father. I wouldn't have chosen to have my sister die at 17. She was my only sibling. There are all kinds of things that I wouldn't have chosen. There are realities that I live with right now that I wouldn't have chosen.
Yeah.
But I still trust that in and beyond them, God's providence is at work, and that God is there. I think that's my answer.
Well, that's a wonderful answer. I'm always encouraged by these interviews, by, like I say, engagement, connection. But I get to learn so much by listening to people like you. And I thank you so much for the story you tell in the book and for the way you write it. I think it's going to bless a lot of people. It's hard to lay the easy life down. but
Yeah.
but if we don't do that, we're going to be living in constant denial, because life isn't easy. and the good life isn't easy. The good life isn't easy.
Right.
And I think your book helps demonstrate that if once we own up to that, it's like, the first step of recovery.
Yeah.
We're moving out of denial to finding a sense of healing and wholeness. So do you have anything coming up? Any events people can come to, conferences that you're speaking at that people might want to come to?
I don't have anything booked for a while especially with COVID. And also a little bit, I've disappeared. I don't have an official teaching position anymore.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm not as on the radar screen as I used to be.
Okay.
I help on a part-time basis with 3 Anglican churches, and they're all, one's large, but 2 are small. And I love that.
Right.
I love that.
That's that kind of the focal practice. Small.
Yeah, it's a small local life, and that fits my values, and I find it very rewarding.
Yeah, wonderful. So the title of the new book is Shattered. A son picks up the pieces of his father's rage. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon. I'll include a link. I think I mentioned. Doesn't come out till next May, but and I'm sure once it gets closer, you'll find it on more websites and bookstores. And I also recommend you go to Arthur's website, because you can get he's written a lot of books, and they're wonderful. ArthurBoers.com. So that's there's a lot to be had there. Do you have any audio there, or is it just books?
I think there's some there. I've done some podcasts and some videos. I think there's some links on my website. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Well, and then hopefully, as the book gets closer, I mean, you might stick with your 3 Anglican parishes, but maybe you'll have some other opportunities to reach out and speak to people. God willing, right? So
that'd be great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Arthur. I've been blessed by this conversation, and I hope it's been a blessing to others.
Thanks very much, John. Great talking to you.
Thanks.
And I still look forward to being face-to-face sometime.
Amen. I hope so too. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. Arthur is a deep well of wisdom, and I was so grateful to spend some time hearing his insights on so many areas of life, healing, forgiveness, and yes, contentment. Check this episode's description for links to pre-order Arthur's newest book and for his main website, where you can purchase his other books and find information on his work and ministry. Also check for links to subscribe to my podcast and my newsletter. If you'd like me to come speak at your church, conference, or retreat on subjects related to my books, relational apologetics, or any other spiritual topic, please send an email to john@embracewhatmatters.com. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is a production of Embrace What Matters Ministries. We encourage you to subscribe, rate and review, share, and please send us a comment or an email. To learn more about John, his devotional book, and other writings, please visit embracewhatmatters.com.